Hello, I'm Stephen Rassi, and I'm going to share with you a presentation on gender diversity. I often share this presentation with parents and families of clients um, when they don't understand about their relative or friend being transgender, and they need to have more information on gender diversity overall. So this is an overall presentation or an overview of gender diversity. I'm going to start with a PowerPoint that I share with these families. So this PowerPoint I would be sharing with a family or friends of a client, and it starts with a section of the PowerPoint that I present when I guest lecture in psychology classes. So I often get invited to guest lecture in introductory psychology classes, and introductory psychology is often in many universities the class that the most students at the university enroll for. So the classes can be very large, and I have often given this lecture in a lecture hall that is like an auditorium that seats 500 students. Of course, when there are 500 students sitting in the lecture hall, and these are all 18-year-olds, and they're young, and the hormones are raging, and they're watching this presentation, and they think no one can identify who they are because there are 500 students there. It is amazing the things that I will hear, and I will share a little bit of that with you today. So this is Zhen Xing from China, and she's a dancer and a choreographer. This is Lynn Conway from Michigan. She is a computer scientist, an electrical engineer, a professor of electrical engineering and computer science emerita. So she's retired from the University of Michigan. And she is a former associate dean of the College of Engineering there. This is Jonna Steele, and she's a Las Vegas showgirl. Now, I can share with you that the last time that I showed this in a psychology class, this is the first point where some of the guys in the audience started hooting and hollering and whistling during the presentation. This is Zhang Lin from China with her husband, Yang Qicheng. This is Haruna Ai from Japan. She's an actress, and she's a very well-known TV personality throughout Japan. This is C. Jacob Hale, PhD, and he is a philosophy professor. This is Faiza Khalida from Brazil. She's a high school English teacher. This is Kelly Vandeveer from the Netherlands, and she's a singer and an actress. This is Lenny Carl Zenith, a musician and a web developer. This is Ben Barris, MD, PhD. He's a neurobiologist and a neurologist. This is Robertina Manganiaro from Italy. And she's a fashion designer, and she's married to Count Gianfranco Torelli. And this is James McGregor Halliman, a steelworker. Now, the last time that I presented this in an introductory psychology class, when I asked the students, what do all of these people have in common? The guys started yelling out, they're all models. And then I think after I told them what they all have in common, I think some of the guys wanted to lose their lunch, because I think they were attracted to some of the people here. The thing is that everybody on this slide was born with a body that was one sex and identified as being one gender, even though they knew they were a different gender. And now they've transitioned and they're living their life with a body that is a different sex. So when I share this information with people, some people want to know things like, what surgeries have these people had and what have they done? And really and truly, what surgeries people have had and what they have in their pants is none of our business at all. All we know is how they present to us and how they are when we meet them. We have no idea what anybody we meet was identified as when they were born. If we go to the grocery store and meet the clerk ringing up our groceries, if we go to the bank and meet the bank teller, if we go and talk to our lawyer, unless we've known them for a long period of time and we knew them when they were younger, we don't know what anybody was identified as at birth. We only know how people present to us. Also, what I'm showing you here today makes it look like gender is very binary, because we're talking about people transitioning their body from male to female or from female to male. But the reality is that gender is not binary. And there are millions of people in this country who are somewhere between male and female, or between men and women, who are either a combination of both men and women, or neither a man or a woman, or they're somewhere on the spectrum in between a man and a woman. So we want to keep in mind that I'm showing you something binary just to illustrate a point, to help understand that many people do transition. Here are some other trans people. So this is Jamie, a film producer and an actor and comedian. This is Michael Mitchell from Australia, who's a leather craftsman. Kimberly is a business administrator who's married and has 4 adopted children. David Harrison is an actor and a playwright. Trista from India is an actress, a poet, and a trans advocate. Alexander John Goodrum was the director and founder of TGNet Arizona, and he lived from 1960 until 2002. Andres Rivera from Chile is a university instructor and an activist. And Marcy Bowers, MD, is an obstetrician, gynecologist, and a surgeon. And she does some of the gender surgeries, the sex reassignment surgeries or gender confirmation surgeries in California. This slide is about Lynn Conway, and it's to introduce the idea that there might be some things that transgender people in general may have in common with each other that might show that they are perhaps more creative in some ways, or they express their creativity more perhaps than cisgender people in some ways. So I know a therapist who tells people that transgender people are just the most wonderful people in the world. Oh, transgender people are so kind and so wonderful. They're so compassionate and thoughtful, this person says. Every single last one of them. And I will be thinking, oh my gosh, some transgender people are murderers and some are thieves. There are all sorts of transgender people, just like there are all sorts of men and women. I do think, though, that it's possible that on average, transgender people may either be more creative or more willing and able to go outside the boundaries and express their creativity than the average cisgender person is. Now, transgender means that the person's gender, what they know they are in their heart and in their mind, is different from the sex that they were assigned at birth because of their body. Cisgender people are people whose gender, what they know they are in their heart and their mind, matches what they were assigned at birth because of their body. So cisgender people are everyone who's not transgender. So if you're transgender, you sort of have to tell people what you see is not what you get until you make whatever transition you want to make. And I'm talking about transgender people who need to transition, because some don't need to transition. But for many transgender people, they have to go outside the box, think outside the box, and tell people, I'm different from what you think. And to be able to do that may enable some transgender people to be a bit more creative. So a good example of this is Lynn Conway. So Lynn Conway is a computer scientist, electrical engineer, and inventor. She's a specialist in VLSI design and in dynamic instruction scheduling for chip processors for computers. Lynn Conway in the 1960s was working at IBM. And at IBM, she developed hardware that allowed us to have computers that you could put under the desktop. Before this, people didn't have computers. The government had computers, but no individual people in the US had computers, because a computer was not just as large as the room that I'm in. A computer was as large as this whole part of a building. But Lynn Conway developed hardware that allowed us to have computers that would fit under the desktop. Now, she was working at IBM, and only the HR department knew that she was a trans person. So when she came out at IBM and said she was going to transition her body to female and that she really was a woman, they let her go. And so they let go the person who had developed the hardware that let us have desktop computers, right? So she had to start from scratch. She had to go back to the drawing board and start all over, because if she put on her resume that she was from IBM, it would have been very difficult to get a job. So she worked her way up from scratch and became a computer science and electrical engineering professor at U of M. And eventually, she became an associate dean at the College of Engineering at University of Michigan. Then in the 1980s and 1990s, Lynn Conway developed hardware that allowed us to have laptops. So they had fired the person who was going to develop laptops. Now, she was living in stealth. Her doctor and her therapist and her husband knew that she was trans, but she was living in stealth. She did not tell people she was trans. She just lived her life as a woman. One day, a professor at Clemson University was researching history of computer architecture, and he was going to publish the history on the internet. So Lynn Conway came out around 2000. She came out as a trans person at University of Michigan, and she came out in a very big way. And she put up her website, www.lynnconway.com. This website is the most authoritative website on transgender concerns that exists. And all of those pictures I showed you of trans people on the earlier two slides, those pictures are all from the success pages at her website. You might want to go and check this website out for more information. Here's the lead-in slide that I didn't have at the beginning, because of course I was not letting these college students know what I was about to present on. But this presentation is an overview of gender diversity. This is the transgender umbrella. This is a picture of the theory that we thought best explained and talked about what transgender people are. It categorized transgender people. According to this theory, there were all these categories across the top of the transgender umbrella diagram. The one on the right for man and woman, that one was for cisgender people, and the others were for transgender people. And then the rows down here were for your biological sex, if you were male or female, and then for your sexual orientation. So all of these things would intersect, and there would be some little box on here that a person would fall into. Well, we don't believe this is the case any longer. We now believe that there are spectra, not boxes, but spectra that people can be in or can be on, and that these spectra much better explain what is going on with transgender people. This transgender umbrella was used a lot in the 1990s, even into the 2000s. It was especially popular around 1995. It uses words like transvestite and transvestic. These words suggest that being transgender is an illness, and we do not believe that at all anymore. Being transgender is like being a woman or like being a man. So we don't use this model today. The older understanding is the same as the newer understanding. In all of the Americas, before the rediscovery of the continent by Europeans, most of the Native American tribes had societies where there were 3, 4, 5, or more genders. So in one tribe, there would be 3 genders, and another, there would be 6 or 7 genders. And this is more than half of the tribes throughout the Americas. in each tribe, in their own tribal language, they would have a word for each of the genders that existed in their tribe. In English, we only have men and women. So if we're going to say some other gender in between these two, we have to make up something like womanly men or manly women. We have to make something up, feminine men, something to describe these genders, but they had specific words for every one of their genders. So if we take gender as a spectrum and we divide it right in the middle and we say that there are men and there are women, they divided this in several different places and they had 4 or 5 genders across here. So in their societies, a woman could marry a man, but she could also marry somebody from one of the other genders. And this was just a perfectly normal thing that was done all the time. And more than half of the tribes had more than 2 genders. It wasn't questioned. This is just how it was in the Americas. In our own society, we have some idea that gender could be on a spectrum. So there's this book, this really brilliant book by Weingarten and Barreca. Weingarten and Barreca are 2 journalists. One of them's a man and one of them's a woman. And so they wrote this book together. And I liked the title so much that I put it right here on the slide. It's I'm with Stupid, One Man, One Woman, 10,000 years of misunderstanding between the sexes cleared right up, as if it's ever going to be cleared up. But in their book, they have their gender-o-meter, and it goes from the most masculine at the top all the way down to the most feminine. And this just is a very nice illustration of how in our society, we understand that there aren't just manly men and womanly women. There's all different sorts of people on a spectrum. Here are some gender spectra from my dissertation. So the first one is how you're identified by other people, what your gender is identified by other people. So over here, other people identify you as a woman. In this area over here, other people identify you as a man. And you could be anywhere on this spectrum. The next spectrum is how you identify yourself. So over here, you identify yourself as a woman. In this area over here, you identify yourself as a man. And you could be anywhere on this spectrum. Down here is the gender role of the clothing that you wear. And I like to use this one to illustrate how all of these spectra could be broken out into more spectra. So you could imagine to start with that there was one spectrum for gender, and we've broken down the gender spectrum into all the spectra on this page and more. But each of these can be broken down further. So for gender role of clothing, on one end it says wear stereotypically feminine clothing. At the other end, wear stereotypically masculine clothing. In the middle would be gender neutral clothing. But we could break this down. We could have more than one spectrum for this. So we could have another spectrum for the clothing that you wear when you're at work. We could have a spectrum for the clothing you wear when you're at home. And you probably would be at a different place as far as masculine or feminine when you're at work from where you are when you're at home. They might be close to each other, but they might be different. And then we can have another spectrum for what you wear when you go out on a Saturday night. And I'm guessing that what you wear when you go out on a Saturday night, it might be different from what you wear at work or at home. Going back to these 2 spectra at the top here for gender and gender identity. If you're in this area here where you're identified by others as a man, then it's very likely that you'll be in this area where you identify yourself as a man as well. So it's unlikely that if you're identified by others as a man, that you would identify yourself as a woman. It's not as common, it's not as typical. It's more rare, but it's very natural. There's no reason that these spectra have to match up. Nobody needs to be on the same end of all the spectrum or all the spectra. They can be anywhere on each spectrum. And so if you're over here and you're over here, and that's rare, it's natural and it's normal. It's just not common, it's not ordinary, it's not usual. Here's a spectrum for sex, the sex of the body. At this end, the person's genetically female. At this end, the person's genetically male. Here's one for body image. At this end, the body image is female. At this end, the body image is male. Well, a person could be over here where they're genetically male, but their body image might be female. And it wouldn't be typical or usual, but it would be normal and natural. That's how nature works, that you can be anywhere on these spectra. I have 3 spectra on here for sexual orientation, but I could easily have more. So the middle one here is for sexual orientation identity, or SOID. On this spectrum, at one end, people identify as gay, lesbian, queer, or non-straight. And at the other end, they identify as straight. And then the one below it is for sexual behaviors. So the person has sex with people of the same sex or gender, or they have sex with people only of a different sex or gender, or somewhere in between. Now, there are people who identify with one sexual orientation, but their behaviors would make us think that they might be a different sexual orientation. We can only go with what people identify as. We cannot call people a sexual orientation other than how they identify. So your identity and your behaviors are not the same thing. Some people might have identity and behaviors match up, but that doesn't mean they're the same thing. Then up here in the middle, we have romantic or sexual or intimate attractions. And this could easily be separated into attractions and fantasies, because a person's fantasies might be for someone who's more masculine or more feminine than what their attractions are to. So we want to think about it, that there are these distinctions and these many, many different ways of looking at these things. Also, romantic attractions and sexual attractions may be very different from each other. So a person could be romantically attracted to women, for example, but they might be sexually attracted to men. Now, this slide has 2 very important spectra at the top, very important to working with transgender people. So the first one at the top on the left side, it says, I am my body. My physical characteristics determine my gender. People at this end of the spectrum will say things like, don't discuss this with me, just look at my body. If my body has a penis, I'm a guy. If it has a clitoris, I'm a girl. End of story, no discussion. At the other end of the spectrum, the person says, I'm separate from my body. My gender is independent from my physical traits. If a person identifies as being at this end of the spectrum, it does not necessarily mean that they are a transgender person. They could be cisgender and their body could match with their gender. However, they're aware of the fact that for them, their body and their gender are 2 separate things. They just happen to match. Whereas the person at the other end says, my body and my gender are not separate things. They not only match, they're the same thing. Now, here's the difficult thing in our society. People at this end of the spectrum do not think that some people at this end of the spectrum, some people at this end of the spectrum do not think that people at this end of the spectrum exist. And some people at this end of the spectrum, bless their hearts, don't think that people at this end of the spectrum exist. But here's the reality. There are people at both ends of this spectrum and everywhere in between. So we want to be respectful of the fact that there are people whose physical characteristics determine their gender and who are their body. And we hope that they will be respectful of people whose body is separate from their gender. The next spectrum here is gender differentiation beliefs. So at the right end of this spectrum, a person believes that women and men, boys and girls, are pretty similar in lots of ways. At the left end, they believe that women and men, boys and girls, are pretty different in lots of ways. So I'm going to give an example of two 5-year-olds with little girl bodies who are little boys inside. And they're 5 years old. One of them is at this end of the spectrum, and the other one is at this end of the spectrum. So the little child who is believing that boys and girls, men and women, are very similar to each other, they're 5 years old. They're not too much worried about this. They're just going along, living their life, and they're assuming that everything's going to be fine because boys and girls are pretty similar. They oftentimes believe that as they get older, they will simply grow a penis. I had a client within the last year who said to me, yep, my brother was 5 years older than I was. I just thought that by the time I was 5 years older, I would grow a penis too. It's not necessarily something they talk about. They don't make a big deal out of it. They just live their life until they hit puberty. And then it's awful. It's horrible. It's terrible for these kids. They hit puberty and their body starts developing in ways that they never thought it would develop. And it can be very, very disturbing and upsetting for them. Some of them know right away that it means they're transgender, and others, it may take until they're in their 20s or 30s or even longer before they understand that this means that they're transgender. At the other end of the spectrum, there are 5-year-old kids with a girl body and a little boy inside who think that men and women and boys and girls are very different from each other in a lot of ways. This little child will be stomping around saying, I'm a boy, and they won't sit down to pee and they won't wear a dress. So it's a very, very different presentation, very different realization, very different time frame of their understanding about their gender identity. This slide is about the sex of babies when they're assigned to one sex or another right after birth. So when a baby is born, the doctors and nurses usually look at the genitals, and then based on the size of the genitals, they assign the child to be a girl or a boy. And depending on how much testosterone is in the womb, the default is that a child will have a clitoris. But if there's enough testosterone in the womb, that clitoris will develop into a penis. And so they're looking at this, the genitals, they're looking at the clitoris or penis, they're seeing how large it is to decide if this is a girl or a boy. Now, what the doctors and nurses say when they can't tell for sure whether it's a boy or a girl, but it's right in between, it's so disturbing for me that I have a hard time presenting this slide. I don't understand the words that they say. So they will tell the parents, your child has ambiguous genitalia. And I don't know what these words mean because I'm really sure that this baby does not think they have ambiguous genitalia. This baby's just got whatever they've got, and that's what they've got. And if we don't wait until the baby's old enough to have words that they can use and to be able to talk and to be able to tell us what gender they are in their heart and in their head, then if we do something to the baby based on what gender we think they are, we might get it wrong. So the doctors and surgeons here at Michigan Medicine, they get a little unhappy with me when I present this slide because they tell me that we're doing a lot better than this in the United States now. And I believe that at Michigan Medicine they are, but I have not seen new research to indicate that the numbers have changed dramatically. So the most recent research that I've seen shows that in the United States, 1 out of every 2,000 babies has surgery done to make them more male or more female before they go home from the hospital. So in the past, the doctors and nurses would say to the family, you need to have surgery for your baby before you take them home. And if you don't have the surgery, it will ruin their life. And then if the parents agree to have the surgery, the next statement is, if you tell your child that you had this surgery for them, it will ruin their life. So you don't want to tell your child about the surgery. So since we don't wait until the child's older, about half of the children who have this surgery done, the surgery will be in the wrong direction from what they need because we didn't find out if they were a boy or a girl internally. And so we're actually making more transgender people by doing these surgeries. Now, I can share with you that we are one of the only developed countries, and that in most developed countries and most non-developed countries, these surgeries are not done. The United States is a rarity. Most places let the child grow up and figure out what's right for them, and then if they need surgery, it can be done. There is a spectrum of gender dysphoria. And so first I need to describe what gender dysphoria is. So gender dysphoria is a diagnostic term from the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for Psychology. So gender dysphoria describes not a disorder. It's not a disorder, it's not a mental illness, but it is dysphoria where a person is having difficulty because their body does not match the gender they know they are. Now, gender and dysphoria are regular English words, and dysphoria means this sense of uneasiness, this sense of there's something wrong here. I can't pinpoint it, but something feels wrong. It just feels really bad. That would be dysphoria. And gender dysphoria is dysphoria because the gender that you are and the sex of your body don't match each other. So your internal sense of gender in your heart and your mind, and then the external, your body, they don't match each other. And the spectrum of gender dysphoria describes all different ways that people feel when they have gender dysphoria. So I'm going to describe two adult women with male bodies at opposite ends of the gender spectrum, gender dysphoria spectrum. So at this end of the gender dysphoria spectrum, there is an adult woman who feels disgust and horror about the mismatch between her body and her gender. So she may be so horrified and disgusted that she cannot look at her body in the mirror. She cannot look down at her body. And she cannot take a shower with the lights turned on. If someone forces her to look at her body, she may get sick at her stomach or she may throw up. And she may have tried to cut her penis off or she may have cut it off. And people come to the hospitals who have done this. So that's one end of the spectrum. A person who's very horrified and disgusted. At the other end of the spectrum, there is a person who says, I have a really great body. I really like my body. My body's very photogenic. People like being in photographs with me. I look good. And I love to play football. It's very invigorating to play football. And I have a nice big male body. And so my team usually wins. People want to be on my football team. And I'm able to pleasure my partner's able to pleasure me, my body feels good, it's very sensual. I have a great body, I really like my body, but why would I have this body when I'm a woman? So there are people all the way across between these two ends of the spectrum, and we used to only provide services for people who were feeling disgust. We didn't provide services for people who thought they had a pretty great body, but who needed it changed. So the fact is that if somebody comes into us knowing how difficult it is to transition their body, and they come in and they say, I need to have hormones and surgery to transition my body, then their gender dysphoria is strong enough that we should be supporting them as well. We should be supporting people all the way across the spectrum of gender dysphoria if they need to transition. Accommodation versus assimilation. So Jean Piaget was a famous child psychologist who said that when children are learning to categorize things, they do these two operations. They assimilate things or they accommodate things. So assimilation would be where you see something new that you haven't seen before, and you put it into one of the categories in your mind that already exist. You fit it into a category, you assimilate it in. Accommodation would be where you make a new category in your mind that didn't exist before. So for example, if a child learned what cars are, they learned that there's a category for cars. And they learned that if you can get in it and it has 4 wheels, you can get in it and it takes you somewhere, then that must be a car. So then they see a fire engine going down the street, and if they go, car, when they see the fire engine, and they've assimilated it into the category for cars. So they don't have a new category. That fire engine is in there with the cars in the same category, and now their category for cars is much larger. It includes a lot of things that fire engines include that didn't used to be in the category for cars. If they were going to do accommodation, they'd make a new category in their mind, and the new category could be for trucks, or it could be for emergency vehicles, or maybe they even have their own category just for fire engines. But making that new category would mean that they are accommodating their mind to what they found in the world. So this happens all the time with gender, and there's been a lot of assimilation that's happened in the past several decades. So K.D. Lang, Michael Jackson, and many, many others have helped us assimilate many different types of men and women into the categories for men and women, so that our categories for men and women are much larger than they used to be and include many more people. So when I was younger, when many of us were decades younger, there was a time when it wasn't just boys don't cry. If a boy cried, or if a man cried, they treated him like he wasn't a man. And men did not hug people. Most men did not hug people. Some men did not even hug their own wives. And many men did not tell anyone that they loved them. These were not considered to be male qualities. And so it was difficult for someone who did these things to be called a man. And gay men were not included as men, and lesbians were not included as women. Now, the world has completely changed. Because of people like K.D. Lang and Michael Jackson and others, we have assimilated all sorts of people into the categories for men and women. So you can turn the TV on now and watch a football game, and the football players will be hugging each other on the field, men hugging other men on the football field in front of 3 million fans. Totally different world than it used to be. And we've assimilated all these people in, and they're all considered to be men nowadays. At the same time, we are accommodating a lot more. So they've created a lot of new categories. There's gender queer, there's two-spirit, there's agender. In Australia, they have driver's licenses that say no gender on them. So we're making new categories, and at the same time, we're expanding the categories that we already had. So our categories for gender are changing very, very quickly. Transgender literally means across or between genders. And if a person's transgender, if the sex of the body does not match the gender, there can be a mismatch in any of several directions. So a person could have a male body, but they could identify as a woman, or they could have a female body, but they could identify as a man, or they could have an intersex body and they could identify as a woman or as a man, or they could have an identity as genderqueer or two-spirit, and they could have either a male or a female body. Lots of ways for a mismatch to happen. So if you're genderqueer or two-spirit and you have either a male or a female body, if you are intersex and you are either a man or a woman, those are also ways that there could be a mismatch. It's not just about a man being in a female body or a woman being in a male body. About half of the people who are transgender need surgery or hormones or both to help them because of their gender dysphoria. And about half of the people who are transgender do not need hormones or surgery because their gender dysphoria is either not existent or it's not strong enough for them to need hormones or surgery. So this is my approximate fractal model of human diversity. Now, a fractal, for those of you who may not know, a fractal is a repeating pattern that repeats at every level of a system. So for example, if you have a leaf, and in the leaf there's a vein that branches into 3, and then each of those branches branches into 3, and then each of those branches branches into 3, the repeating pattern is that keeps branching into 3. This is called an approximate fractal because in mathematics, a fractal goes on to infinity. But we're talking about human beings. We're talking about things that are physical. So it's not going to go to infinity. So we're going to call it an approximate fractal. Fractals are used oftentimes to predict things. So, you know, if there's an expressway and then there are side streets and then there are smaller side streets, the repeating pattern is the streets get smaller and smaller and smaller as you move off of this expressway. There could be an ocean, and then there could be big bays by the ocean, then there could be rivers, and there could be tributaries, and then there could be streams. And that again would be a fractal repeating over and over this division of the water. So in this case, for this model of human diversity, the fractal or pattern is diversity. That's the pattern. At every level that we look at on here, there's diversity. So within human beings, there's diversity. There's all these different areas to look at. And then in each of these, if we go down a level, there will be more diversity. If we go down another level, there will be more diversity, etc. So I like to start with religion. And if we go down a level under religion, we will have many religions. There will be Christianity, and there will be Islam, and there will be Judaism, and there will be Rastafarian. There will be just many religions. And then if we go down another level under Christianity, we will have at least Catholic and Protestant. And if we go down another level under Protestant, we will have Presbyterian and Methodist and Southern Baptist and many, many other religions. And if we go down another level, we get to where within each of these religions, there are different synods. So there'd be the Kentucky Synod and the Florida Synod and the Missouri Synod in the religion. And then if we went down another level, we would get down to congregations. And then if we went down a level, we would get to the parishioners within the congregation. And the fascinating thing about diversity is how diverse everyone is. So you'd be hard pressed to find any two parishioners in a congregation who have all of exactly the same beliefs about their religion. The diversity is just incredible. And that same diversity happens with all of the other categories, everything else that's on this diagram. Now, if we went down under race, under eyes, there'd be color of eyes would be one of the qualities, and under skin, one of the qualities would be color of skin. And I ask people, have you ever seen somebody with really dark skin and blue eyes? And most people who've seen someone like this remember it because it's such a rare thing. It's so unusual. So I remember that when I was a teenager, I met two different people, two different times. I met people who had blue eyes and dark skin. And I've remembered that for decades, which is so amazing. There's also the wonderful National Geographic cover that has someone with blue eyes and dark skin on it. The thing is that this is a very unusual combination of traits, quite rare, but it's completely natural. The way that nature works, it's completely natural to be anywhere at all on these spectra. And not only is it completely natural, it's also completely normal. So any of the combinations of the things that we see on this diagram is going to be normal and natural, whether it is typical and ordinary and usual, or whether it is rare and unusual. Any combination is still going to be natural and normal. So I'm going to take the section on gender over here and blow this up larger. So under gender, we've got these 6 different spectra. So let's look first at genetics. So for genetics, we get taught in school that there are XX chromosomes and XY chromosomes for gender. But the reality is, and what we get taught in more advanced classes, the reality is that there are 23 different combinations of genes. So there's XXY, and there's XYY, and there's XXX. And the other very amazing thing is that your genes do not have to match what your body looks like. So if you and I went to someplace in Ann Arbor where there's 100 women gathering together, and we went to this group of 100 women, I could just about safely bet you that 1 or 2 of those women will have XY chromosomes. That's just a usual thing that happens. And they look like women. Unless they get tested, they're not going to know that they have different chromosomes. Then we have physical features. So I like to point out that nearly everyone has a combination of male and female physical features. And again, I also like to point out that we assume that what we consider to be male or female in our country, that it's that way everywhere in the world, but it is not necessarily that way everywhere in the world. But in our country, we say that certain things are more masculine or more feminine physical features. So I like to use an example. We tend to think here than in the US that more body hair is more masculine and less body hair is more feminine. And we tend to think that more muscles is more masculine and less muscles is more feminine. So I ask people, what is Brad Pitt, a man or a woman? And you know, every single person I've ever asked knows immediately, instantly, that Brad Pitt is a man. It's completely clear. So then I ask, well, how do we know that? Because if we look at muscles, obviously Brad Pitt has got to be a man. But if we look at body hair, you could say that Brad Pitt would be a woman. So who decided that muscles are more important than body hair? But yet we have this understanding in our country. Nobody taught us as kindergartners, nobody gave us a little test. What's more important as to whether you're masculine or feminine, your body hair or your muscles? But yet we all have these ideas from how we grew up in this society. But again, we're all combinations of male and female characteristics. Then we have sexual orientation. I've moved the behaviors for sexual orientation over here under gender expression. But we've already discussed that there are many different variations on sexual orientation, and we talked about that on an earlier slide. Then we have brain sex. So brain sex is a test there's a test for brain sex that's given by psychologists. It's a pen and paper test that you fill out, and it has what many people think are very stereotypical characteristics on the test. And I will not argue that they're not stereotypical. They are, but we use these to look at whether brain sex is uh, more masculine, more feminine. So on this test, when you get the results back, there are a whole range of female brain scores and a whole range of intermediate brain scores and a whole range of male brain scores. And wherever you score on the brain sex test, that does not have to match up with your body at all. Doesn't have to match up with your gender identity at all. Doesn't have to match with your sexual orientation at all. This is about your brain sex. So if you study the biologists who know about brain sex, some of them say that there are 3 stages of brain development in the womb, and some say that there are 5 stages of brain development in the womb. And at each stage of brain development, the brain may be more masculinized or not. The default is a female brain. But if there's enough testosterone in the brain at any of these stages of development, the testosterone will masculinize the brain to some extent during that stage. So a person's brain could be very masculine in every way, or it could be only masculine in some ways because there was only a lot of testosterone at certain stages of development, or it could be completely female. So the questions on the brain sex test that you take, measurement, the questions are very stereotypical. They're questions about how you use numbers, how good you are with math. They're questions about how you use maps, how you see things spatially, how you find directions. There are questions about how domineering you are, how aggressive or assertive you are, and questions about how nurturing you are. So I like to use examples from a couple of our presidents for this brain sex example. So I'm going to give an example of Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was a man in every way. Everything else on here, you'd probably say he qualified as a man. But with brain sex, he was very, very nurturing, more nurturing than most presidents. So that's very interesting. He may have had gender neutral brain sex, or he may have been more female brain sex, but probably not so masculine for his brain sex. And then we have Hillary Clinton. And Hillary Clinton may be female in every other way, but for her brain sex, she's more domineering, more assertive, and so she would probably qualify as more masculine brain sex. So I like to use these examples. By the way, I'm going to share something I don't always share with everyone, and that is in the womb, the brain is masculinized when there's more testosterone in the brain. There is a brain-body membrane that separates the brain from the rest of the body, and it only allows small particles to get through it. It doesn't allow larger molecules, so it can protect the brain from things that might damage the brain. So testosterone is too large of a molecule to pass through the brain-body membrane. But estrogen is able to pass through the membrane. So when enough estrogen gets into the brain, it gets changed, it gets modified. The estrogen is turned into testosterone inside the brain. And then the testosterone masculinizes the brain. So when a baby's brain is masculinized, it's because there was more estrogen in the womb. It's a very, very interesting thing. Okay, now we have expression. And one of the ways that we express ourselves is our occupation. So a person might be a fireman, they might be a ballerina, they might be something more gender neutral, like a scientist or a teacher. Their clothing, they might dress up in very masculine clothing or in very feminine clothing or in something that's more gender neutral. And then their behaviors. They may walk like John Wayne, they may walk like Marilyn Monroe, they may swear like a sailor. They're all different ways that people can express themselves. And again, none of these things have to match up with each other, and none of them have to match with a person's gender identity. And the gender identity is what they know themselves to be in their heart and in their head, what they know about themselves. So a person could have XY chromosomes. They could be 6'5", very hairy, very muscular. They could be only attracted to women. They could be very, very, very domineering and aggressive. They could be a fireman who wears all kinds of masculine clothes and who walks like John Wayne and who swears like a sailor. And they could still identify as a woman. And if they identified as a woman when everything else was more male, that would be very, very rare. And it might be so rare, maybe even their own therapist would have a hard time understanding that this was true. Might be very, very difficult for the person if in every other way they were masculine, and then in this one way their gender identity was as a woman. The thing is, no matter how rare it is, it'll be completely natural and completely normal. And that's the main thing that I point out to families and parents of trans people, is that whatever your person's identity is, it's natural and normal. Now, the prevalence of gender nonconforming and trans people in the United States. If we're going to see what % of people in the United States are trans, we need to count the gender nonconforming and the trans people. If we don't, this could be a huge problem. So in my survey that I sent out for my dissertation, there were about 1,560 some responses. My survey was sent to all the teaching faculty at all of the accredited Master of Social Work programs in the US and Puerto Rico. So about 6,000 people got the survey. 1,560 some responded. And I had 4 questions about gender on there. So there was a question asking, what is your gender identity? And then I asked, what is the sex of your body? And then I asked, what is your sexual orientation? And then I asked, if you have more information to share with us that would help us to better understand your gender identity, the sex of your body, and your sexual orientation, please write it here. So out of the 1,560 some people, over 200 wrote something there, and many people wrote paragraphs of information. So there was a man who wrote, I checked the boxes for man and for male and for straight because that's how I identify. It's true that I had a female body when I was born, but I don't identify as a woman and I don't identify as transgender. I'm a man and my body is male, and that's how I identify. And there was a woman who filled it out and said, you know, I checked the boxes for woman and female and lesbian because that's how I identify. And it's true that at birth, my body was male, but I don't identify as a man and I don't have a male body now. So I identify as a woman. So if I would not have asked this open-ended question, I would not have found all the people who were transgender who were responding to my survey. Very, very important how we ask these questions of people. So at the Williams Institute, where Gates is from, they have done an estimate of what % of people in the United States are trans or gender nonconforming. And their estimate was 0.3%, but it didn't include gender nonconforming people. So a few years later, the Williams Institute came out with a correction, and they said, we're correcting our estimate. It should be higher. It should be about 0.6%. However, even though they made this correction, they did not change their protocols. They did not change the methods they were using to get people to see what their estimate would be. So we believe that this is an undercount, it's an underestimate. In Massachusetts, they did an actual survey. This was about a 3-hour survey with tons of questions on all different sorts of things. And there was just this one question out of the whole 3 hours that said, do you identify as transgender? And 0.5%, half a percent, 1 out of every 200 people identified as transgender on this question. But again, they didn't include non-transsexual identities and gender nonconforming people. So we need better information than this. It's considered to be an undercount. Lynn Conway from the earlier slide, Lynn Conway, the Associate Dean of the College of Engineering at University of Michigan. Lynn Conway and her colleague Oli Sliker, they did an educated estimate of the lower bounds of prevalence. So to do this educated estimate, they took some things that we know to be true. So every hospital in the world where they do gender confirmation surgeries has a count of exactly how many surgeries they've done in their hospital. And they looked at how many surgeries have been done, and they looked at what percent of the trans community actually has surgery. And then they were able to work their way back, and they were able to find that the lowest bound for this is 1%. The absolute minimum percentage of people that are trans in the US is 1%. We believe that it's between 1 and 3%, but it's at least 1%. This means between 3 and 9 million people in the US are transgender. Again, we want to keep in mind that half of those people need hormones or surgery to help with their gender dysphoria, and half of them do not need hormones or surgery to help with the gender dysphoria. In my survey of the teaching faculty at all the accredited US and Puerto Rico MSW programs, I found that 1% of the respondents were in one of the trans categories. So even though there are very few faculty who are out as trans anywhere, we still found 1%. So that does support this idea that the minimum is 1%, but it likely is more than that. I can also share that at Pioneer High School in Ann Arbor, there are over 1,800 students at the high school. And a few years ago, an academic counselor from the high school shared with me that they have a support group. The support group is for trans-identified students. This is not for friends and allies of trans students. The support group is for trans students who say that they are trans. So in this support group, you would expect that if they had 18 students, that would be 1% of their 1,800 students at the school. But they actually had 23 students in their support group. So that's about 1.5% of the school population for identifying as trans and attending the support group. And this is people who already know that they're trans before they're 18 years old. So we expect that it's a little bit higher than that by the time they're older. Here are all the references for the statistics I just shared with you about prevalence. So there is this concept of identity foreclosure. So let's say you've got a kid and your kid comes in, let's say they're 8 years old, and they come in to see you, and their parents, they say, Mommy, Daddy, I'm gonna be a scientist when I grow up. And so for the next 3 months, you hear about them being a scientist when they grow up. And then they come in and they say, you know, I changed my mind. I'm going to be a doctor when I grow up. And so now you hear about this for a couple of weeks. And then they see a really nice cake that was baked in the bakery. And they come and say, you know, I changed my mind. I'm going to be a baker when I grow up. And that's what you hear about for the next 2 months. Well, when this kid hits on an identity that really fits them well, we say that they foreclose on the identity. And it's just like a bank foreclosing on a house. Once this child forecloses on an identity, they take that identity, they make it their own. Now it belongs to them. So they don't say, I'm going to be a baker when I grow up. They say, I am a baker. They've now foreclosed on this identity and it's a part of them. The problem is when a person forecloses on an identity, they think it's the right one for them. And then later on in life, they learn about other identities that they didn't know about when they were finding an identity. And one of the identities they didn't know about fits them better than the one they already foreclosed on. When that happened, they have to tear down the identity they've built up for themselves and they have to build a new identity as this new person. When that happens, we say that they had done premature identity foreclosure. They foreclosed on their identity too early. This happens a lot with LGB and transgender kids. So I'm going to give an example again of a 5-year-old in a little girl body, but it's a little boy in the little girl body. So this 5-year-old presumably doesn't know about transgender identities and probably doesn't know about gay or lesbian identities yet. So they're 5 years old. They probably have this idea that when they grow up, they'll be a heterosexual, cisgender woman, and that they're going to marry a man, have children, maybe even live in a house with a white picket fence, the whole 9 yards. So they've sort of foreclosed on this identity already, even at the age of 5. So they're going along and they're living their life, and they get to teenage, they get to puberty, and the hormones start raging, and lo and behold, it turns out they're attracted to girls. And they never thought that would happen. Well, now they have to tear down their identity, and they have to build a new identity as a lesbian. They have to come out to their parents and their family and their friends, and that can be a lot of work. That can be very difficult, and they might be treated very badly by some people. They could even be disowned by their family. It's a lot of work to tear down your identity and build a new one, even when you have a lot of support. So it can be so difficult to rebuild your identity like that, that we think that this may be one reason that it often appears that more lesbian and gay people are transphobic than straight people. And it may be because lesbian and gay people may sometimes be afraid that if they're transgender, then they would have to tear their identity down again. They'd have to come out to people again. And it was really a struggle the first time they had to do that, so they don't want to go there. So some gay and lesbian people say, oh, don't talk to me about that trans stuff. They just don't want to hear about it. Anyhow, this kid now identifies as a lesbian, and they're now building their new identity as a lesbian. They've told their family and their friends, and they start living as a lesbian. So they're 12 or 13 years old. Now they're living as a lesbian, and they go along 3, 4, 5 years, and they just don't fit in with the other lesbians. And they try, but they just don't feel the same way about things that the other lesbians feel. They don't fit in. And then they learn about transgender people. Oh my gosh, so that's what it is. I'm a transgender man. So now they have to tear down their identity as a lesbian and rebuild their identity as a transgender man. They have to come out to their family and their friends and their parents. They may even go to the doctor and get hormones. They might even get surgery because they're identifying as a trans man. So the concern is that it could be that they would go along for another 3, 4, 5 years or more, and they would find that they just don't fit in with the trans men either. And if that happened, maybe then they would learn that there are non-binary identities. And maybe they'll say, oh my gosh, I didn't know there were non-binary identities. I'm really a two-spirit person, or I'm really a genderqueer person. Well, if they're two-spirit or genderqueer or agender, some non-binary people need surgery just as much as a binary person does because there's this mismatch and they feel a lot of gender dysphoria. But some non-binary people do not need surgery or hormones. So if they haven't explored this, and if it turns out that they actually are a non-binary person, they may not have needed to do the surgery or hormones that they did. So we do encourage people, if they are transitioning, we encourage them to think about all their options as they move ahead before they take steps that would change their body. So these different things, all these different considerations that I've just shared here, these are the reasons that if someone is trans, they probably want to see a good, educated, and experienced gender therapist to help them think about these things, work through these things, figure out what's best for them so they can tell the therapist and tell their doctors and tell their parents and families what's best for them and get the services that they need. Thank you very much, and I hope that you enjoyed the presentation.